Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to this webinar on GBV risk mitigation in cash and voucher assistance. So I will start with a little bit of housekeeping. The webinar will be recorded and it will last 1 hour. And of course, we will share the recording with all of you right after the webinar. We ask you to use the Q&A window during the session for any question you may have, because at the end of the presentation, we will have a Q&A session and we will select a few questions from the Q&A. Also, if you have any comments or questions after the webinar, we please ask you to send us an email to ho-cva@unfpa.org. We will make sure to put the email address again in the chat box. Also, please note that if we reach 500 participants, this will be streamed on YouTube. So you will be redirected to YouTube with a slight delay. So this is the agenda for today. We will begin with a presentation of our panelist speakers, followed by some opening remarks by Isabelle Pelli from DG ECO. This will be followed by a brief overview of our approach to GBV risk mitigation in cash and voucher assistance, and we will present the toolkit, which has been recently finalized. The bulk of today's webinar will be the presentation from cash colleagues from 3 different contexts. They will showcase their field learning, but also how they contextualize the tools. And after this country's presentation, we will have some closing remarks from Lee Ashley Lipscomb, representing the GBV AoR, and we will end with a short Q&A session. So my name is Luana de Souza. I'm a GBV and CVA specialist based in UNFPA Humanitarian Office in Geneva. So I feel extremely lucky today to have with me such a rich panel of experts. So I will start by introducing Isabelle Pelli, thematic expert cash and basic needs at DG ECO, and Lee Ashley Lipscomb, who is a GBV regional advisor for Asia Pacific for the GBV AoR. Then I'm also extremely honored and thankful to have 3 cash experts from the field with me today. So I'm working with them actually closely, and it's really nice to have you here today. George Bete, cash working group lead from Afghanistan. Mireya Termes, the cash working group lead for Iraq. And Yigit Anil Gürer, the cash working group lead for Moldova. So we engage with many more cash and GBV colleagues over the past 2 years, and the achievement that we will show you today could not have been made possible without their engagement. So I would like here to really thank them as well. Also, a special thanks to the Swiss Cooperation and Development Agency, who has been supporting this initiative since the very beginning. So I would like now to give the floor to Isabelle Pelli, who will do the opening remarks. Isabelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Pleasure to be here with all of you, and I hope you can hear me all well. So I just wanted to start with a bit of the overall policy framework for today's webinar, which is the humanitarian sector's underlying commitment to the centrality of protection, including risk mitigation in humanitarian cash and voucher assistance. And from a donor perspective, this is front and center of the joint donor statement on humanitarian cash assistance, which underlines our joint commitment to prioritizing cash programs that put people at the center and that seek, share, and act upon feedback from recipients, and to funding cash programs that mainstream protection and gender concerns and include referral systems to other services. So what does this look like in terms of practice and evidence? Firstly, as you all know, there's an increasing body of evidence demonstrating that CVA can strengthen protection assistance and more effectively achieve protection outcomes if coupled with other more traditional delivery modalities within the protection sector, such as case management and MHPSS. Secondly, and in parallel, as the scale and breadth of CVA continues to grow, the importance of protection and gender analysis mainstreaming is evident, and the toolkit and experiences we'll be discussing today are a crucial contribution to this mainstreaming goal. So in terms of the toolkit itself, what added value does it bring? The underlying principle is that cash is not inherently riskier than other modalities, But as for any modality, it's key to apply a gender and protection lens programming to not overlook potential risks, or even worse, exacerbate or create new risks. And indeed, because of context-specific gender dynamics and protection risk, cash and vouchers may result in specific risks from a GBV lens. So, for example, access to markets could prove risky for both women and men in specific contexts. And other possible risks may be those associated with different delivery mechanisms, with data collection and sharing, and with intra-household and community power dynamics. So therefore, the toolkit's risk analysis matrix and its key dimensions, which will be presented by Luana and then explored by panelists in the case studies, are really welcome. And such analysis and actions are critical for GBV risk mitigation, but also benefit the response as a whole, for example, by contributing to improving participation or the quality of complaint and feedback mechanisms. So from a donor perspective, what does this look like? I just wanted to highlight how these considerations are reflected in ECHO's policies. So firstly, we have our gender and age marker, which outlines our expectations in terms of adapting assistance on the basis of context-specific gender-sensitive needs assessments and gender analysis, noting that women should not be considered the most vulnerable by default, as well as the prevention and mitigation of GBV-related risks. Secondly, we have our protection mainstreaming key objective indicator, which is our way of concretely measuring, among other elements, the mitigation of protection risks, including GBV. And just to note that this is now the standard methodology recommended by the Grand Bargain cash workstream for multi-purpose cash. And for information, there'll be an e-learning on this protection mainstreaming indicator ready by the end of this month. And then finally, our recently published cash policy provides further guidance. So firstly, we have protection and gender analysis and risk mitigation mainstream throughout. And then also there's a protection section of Annex 3, which outlines from ECHO's perspective how cash and vouchers can be used to contribute to protection outcomes. And this is really more than ticking the box. These policy directions are key to our review of proposals, and we expect our partners to concretely adapt actions on the basis of these findings, and really to demonstrate how safety, dignity, access, accountability, and participation are systematically monitored and programs adapted accordingly. I think the reason there's so many of us online today is that cash continues to drive innovative thinking in the humanitarian sector. But still more can be done in CVA to ensure we don't put populations at further risk and thus drive quality improvements for the sector as a whole. So I'm looking forward to hearing from fellow panelists on how they've been doing this in practice. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Isabel, for these great and inspiring remarks. So there is indeed a push on this topic, and I think at global level, and I think we can see that, as Isabel mentioned, in donors' engagement, but also through the various global work streams and the guidance that has been produced in the past years. I'm thinking mostly about the compendium to the GBV guidelines on cash and GBV, which you can see here on the screen, and the purple documents. But I'm also thinking about IRC and WRC guidance, to name only a few. So what we have seen, however, is that this guidance has not been completely, or the tools that go with the guidance have not been completely absorbed or integrated at field level. And what we felt that was missing was really some concrete and easy to use tools, speaking the cash language, but also a strong engagement with the ones that are actually implementing cash programming. So this is the approach that we used in the past 2 years. So we engaged through GBV coordination groups at field level, using UNFPA GBV AoR mandate. So what is really important to note is that these various engagement at field level have always started with field requests. So it's really not a top-down approach, but very much a bottom-up approach. So this was really positive because it allowed us to have a really strong buy-in from both CVA and GBV specialists at field level. And so they really welcomed our targeted and tailored support in country or remotely during the COVID time. So we used to do really this pilot approach, almost always starting by conducting a GBV risk analysis of cash programming in country and identifying also potential mitigation measures. And this was usually done with a small group of cash and GBV experts in country through, let's say, workshops. And this allowed us to bridge silos and to make sure that we were learning from each other and speaking the same language. So quickly, based on the results from this risk matrix exercise, we realized that we need to have short and easy to use tools that could be easily integrated into the day-to-day work of the cash colleagues. So we developed tools in close coordination with those colleagues at field level, and we contextualized and piloted them in various settings. So in parallel of this engagement at country level, we drafted learning briefs and case studies to make sure that we were also building evidence of this approach and the results at global level, so to increase the visibility at global level of the topic, but also as well to support advocacy at national level. So these different tools have been finalized and translated, and today I'm really happy to be able to say that they are available, so you can download them on our website. So you can see that they vary in format and length, but every tool has been developed keeping in mind that we are all extremely busy, and so we need very handy and short guidance, some checklists, some easy to extract PDM questions, or some questions that you can ask in focus group discussion with women, for instance. I would like to insist on the risk matrix, that is the tool number 3, which is extracted from the compendium, because it's really much the key tool. It's probably the best one to start with. Also important to note that these are not, these tools are not meant to cover the entire topic of cash and GBV. And we have tried as much as possible to put links to additional resource in each of these tools if you want to learn more. And of course, and here I'm talking as well to GBV and to cash colleagues, I think it's really important that cash colleagues know that there are GBV coordinators or GBV protection people at country level that can help you, to identify those risks, to contextualize those tools, and that can bring this GBV lens to cash programming. So again, I would like to thank field colleagues for the great collaborative work. And of course, I count on your feedback, or if you see anything missing, or if you have any comments to these tools. And also, please know that there will be more tools and learning briefs that will be added this year and next year. So I will stop here because I would like to give enough time to my cash colleagues to present their side of the story and to showcase the field experience. So George, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, Luana, thank you so much. I believe you can hear me clearly. Please confirm.
Yes, it's all good.
Oh, okay, good. So colleagues, greetings. I just have close to 7 minutes here to compress what we have in Afghanistan related to the topic. So I will begin by aligning the context that led to our work to consider seriously issues to do with GBV and other mainstream themes. The 2022 Afghanistan Humanitarian Needs Overview projected 22.4 million people to be in dire need of humanitarian assistance over the course of this year. It was developed, earlier this year. CVA is pinpointed in the HRP as a go-to modality. And in fact, we are witnessing a continued scaling up of CVA in 2022. And we also anticipate for that to happen in 2023. Actually, we have started working on the 2023 HRP. The 2022 mid-year Wall of Afghanistan assessment by REACH reports financial barriers and lack of employment as amongst the major drivers of poverty and vulnerability in this country. We have also noted from the Wall of Afghanistan assessment that cultural and societal barriers are affecting women's access to basic services as they are increasingly required to have a male companion, or because of long-standing traditional issues. On the ground, when we are implementing CVA and due to logistical constraints, cash actors are increasingly relying on Hawala as well as direct cash tokens as payment modalities. And to conclude on the context, taking all this into consideration and beginning in September 2021, that is the period which followed political change in this country, we actually anticipated GBV risks to increase drastically. And we still think that the risks are evident. This does not only relate, to cash programming only. And I think, Luana, you are moving to my next slide, which is on the main GBV risks identified. Now, immediately after the political transition, which took place last year in August, we put our hands on the deck. By that time, I am glad that Vlad is here with us today and Molugeta, where we identified risks that threatened effective CVA implementation. Among some of the challenges that we anticipated as a result of the political transition when Taliban took over were taxation, increased isolation of women and girls, affecting their access to humanitarian support, and also we were worried about political acceptance of CVA as a modality. Therefore, we then identified specific risks which were in our context. And now, related to GBV, we identified targeting that it was a risk which was threatening particularly female-headed households, including widows, minorities, and women at risk. We also anticipated that the use of the mehram, a male companion, would limit the freedom of women to travel to registration centers and also to distribution centers, including issues to do with the difficulty of recruiting female staff, who will work in our responses. But again, this was not specific to CVA. Then we also thought that lack of IDs for some specific groups may also prevent access for people to access certain services. We were worried also by the newly arriving actors, particularly in the private sector, and on our side, financial service providers, the new hawalas. We were worried about issues to do with ensuring confidentiality of data, and we thought that would affect not only women, but also everybody in this country. Then challenges in including women to participate in certain cash-based modalities. For example, cash for work. We thought that this was going to be an issue. And lastly, in terms of the risks which we identified, the major bottleneck which we envisaged and which we think still aligns, maybe Elisa, you may actually agree with me, is the issue to do with staff and staff turnover, limited capacity in terms of implementing effective CVA. And my colleague Rami, who is with me in this core as well, we have started capacity building elements in that. However, on the GBV side, you may see that some of the people whom we would have trained as cash frontliners may really change or shift work and go outside of Afghanistan. Then the last slide on my presentation, the tools and guidance and training, Luana. What did we do as Cash and Voucher Working Group to align with our ambitions to ensure that GBV and other mainstream themes were implemented in Afghanistan? We developed a tip sheet where we worked with our GBV colleagues here, and we shared that with our cash actors. That tip sheet was outlining key considerations in regards to women's rights and safety. Also, we worked on a cash position paper. I mentioned that we thought that the new models of working by the Taliban here would affect smooth implementation of CVA. So that paper reiterated the reasons for cash and also why we should include women and girls and other minority groups. The paper was used as a basis to extract talking points by CVA actors when engaging with local authorities. We updated an interagency PDM, taking it over from our predecessors. They left the PDM, we updated it, where we actually revised and put questions related to women's safety and access. We added that, and some generic questions to measure the impact of CVA on communities, as well as community household dynamics, and monitor any tensions which could be fueled by CVA. As the tool is being currently used by our members, we need to collect the data from partners and analyze it further to really begin to consider what it means implementing CVA, amongst the risks which I reiterated earlier on. Then we also had discussions with the financial service providers. I remember that Luana and Elisa were part of the panel where we were talking with quite a number of financial service providers immediately after the political transition. What was the reason? We wanted them to consider issues to do with GBV and consider also, issues that affect women. And in addition, cash actors were encouraged to consider including language that addresses women or girls' protection during cash distributions in their third-party service providers' contracts. Then we also developed a cash list for Afghan Humanitarian Fund, the AHF. In fact, Cash and Voucher Working Group, we review proposals for AHF. And so we developed a checklist, which we shared with CVA actors to consider mainstream themes, which include GBV as well. And the Cash and Voucher Working Group ensures that mainstream themes are actually well articulated in all proposals which are submitted to AHF. Then sometimes GBV risks are aligned or even stronger to the type of cash modality. Like I said earlier, recently we have seen an increased interest by actors here to implement cash for work. And what are we doing? So the key, the CVWG is developing guidance to ensure women participation and involvement. And lastly, MPCA is meant to, include all marginalized groups in the society, including women. We are revising our MEB right now, ensuring that the needs which are also encountered by women are addressed in that document. And lastly, what are the next steps which we would like to consider? Like I said, we are revising our cash for work guidance, which we will ensure has women participation and will be shared in the next weeks with our members. The revision of the MEB is nearly complete. We think by next week or so, it will be disseminated. And finally, we think we would like to do more engagement with our frontliners, including prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse, the accountability to affected population group, and the GBV. We will continue to work with them and include them in the capacity building initiatives, which are the Cash and Voucher Working Group is rolling out. Thank you so much, and back to you, Luana.
Thank you so much, George. And I think we should be extremely thankful to have people like you in Afghanistan in such difficult contexts. So thank you once again for the presentation and for all the work that you are doing in Afghanistan. So we will now move to Iraq. Mireya will present the work that we have been doing. Mireya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luana, and hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today and present our experience in Iraq. Just to start, let me give you a briefing of the current context here in the country, because after many years of humanitarian response, we are now working on this transition to more development, durable solutions. So we know that there are still some humanitarian needs in the country, especially in particular geographical locations, but also in specific population groups. But it's also time to move. The funding is decreasing, the stabilization is in process, and sustainable solutions are needed as well. So the cluster system is going to get deactivated by the end of the year, and all the clusters on the cash working group, we are working on this transition strategy. For the cash working group, we are conducting some specific activities to make this transition process smooth. And one of the things that we did together with the GBV subcluster was a 2-day workshop at the end of June, where we gathered practitioners from both cash and GBV profiles to discuss basically some priorities and GBV risk mitigation anticipatory actions for this transition of cash assistance. The result of this workshop was the drafting an action plan to be integrated in the cluster transition plans. And in this action plan, we identify some key risks and mitigation measures as well. What I'm going to highlight today is some of these risk and mitigation measures or actions that we identified. The first one is that there is still a large number of population that are still lacking some kind of civil documentation. This is calculated at around 1 million people in Iraq. This is really affecting some population groups. We are thinking here on female widows, female head of households that are what is called perceived ISIS-affiliated families. And this poses a real challenge for them to get access to the social protection schemes. We see now an opportunity that recently there was a parliamentary law that allocates additional budget to the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, which is responsible of the implementation of the cash-based social assistance. This additional budget aims to expand the social registry. And in this sense, we found the opportunity to advocate for a better inclusion of this population. Another risk that we identified is that government staff, also including financial service providers, might not be seen as neutral and accountable as the humanitarian actors. And this is very important also regarding to the understanding or the considerations towards GBV survivors. So in this sense, we found important to provide some basic GBV and PSCA training, but also to make sure that these frontliners as well, they have teams balanced in terms of gender and diversity. The third risk is related to the complaints and feedback mechanisms. There are different mechanisms here in country, including each organization, they have their own systems, but also what is important is that UNOPS is running the Iraq Information Center. This is a huge call center that anyone in the country can call to raise their cases. Many of the cases that are raised are related to cash programs, asking for information basically, or asking if they can get registered for cash assistance. And in this transition, we see now that perhaps with the decrease of funding and resources, this mechanism might be less functioning or with less quality or less capacity. So for this, the key action is to ensure that these communication channels can continue functioning and with a good quality, but also to ensure that there is an extensive community outreach to engage with community leaders, community representatives, etc., so population can also raise their voice as well. And next slide, please. Thanks. And another risk that we identified is related to data. So we know that humanitarian actors, we have our own data protection policies and data protocols, but there is the question to see if this can be kept after the humanitarian response concludes. We are aware that perhaps some institutional knowledge can be lost during this process. So it's very important to continue ensuring that the data protocols are in place to mitigate risk of fraud, corruption, abuse and exploitation by employees, by financial service providers as well, and to keep the accountability. Something that we also considered is that whenever possible, it would be good to have also neutral stakeholders doing some monitoring and data spot checks. And the last risk that we identified is related to access to markets and also how the cash assistance is managed at the household level. So in Iraq, people have access to markets freely. There are not many challenges, but it's true that we see that GBV survivors, for example, they are more stigmatized and then they have more challenges in accessing markets. We see also that in some households, the management of the cash received might be controlled by men predominantly. And then also that too often boys are privileged over girls in terms of how cash is spent. We also see that there are still a lot of negative coping mechanisms, especially relying on debts is very important in Iraq. Every family has debts. And we see that with this transition, probably the transfer values will be lower than the humanitarian transfer values. For example, the transfer value of MPCA is higher than the social assistance. So if they are receiving less amount of money, probably they will rely on more negative coping mechanisms. And this includes as well a potential increase of child marriage as well. Here are some key actions that we identify is first to allow female beneficiaries to nominate someone else to receive the cash assistance to ensure their safety. But also what is very important is that some organizations started putting some actions in place. This includes conducting private assessments with only women to understand the household dynamics, but also to adapt activities, particularly to make sure that, that there is female participation. And just to wrap up, two things to take in consideration through all this process. The first one is to get the buy-in from the government from the very beginning to increase the accountability and the ownership in all this transition process. And the second thing is to continue engaging with the durable solutions actors, especially with the durable solutions mechanism that here in Iraq is the umbrella of the humanitarian and development nexus, to make sure that national and international NGOs are part of all of these discussions. That's all from my side. Thanks, Luana, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Mireia. Iraq is definitely a very interesting context, and I'm looking forward to see how this will develop in the next months. So the last presentation from today is from Yiğit from Moldova, Cash Working Group in Moldova. So Yiğit, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I would like to start my presentation to give a brief information on the context first, and then I will go through the key findings that we found out through our GBV risk analysis exercise conducted together with GBV actors and cash actors in the country. So when we come to context, the conflict in Ukraine has caused unparalleled levels of displacement in Europe, impacting the neighboring countries to Ukraine. Since the beginning of the Ukrainian conflict, Moldova has received almost 600,000 refugees, with the majority traveling directly onwards to other destinations in Europe. Nearly 90,000 refugees currently remain in Moldova, and the majority of whom being women and girls, with 64%. Under RRP, 477 million requested for cash and voucher assistance, which is the largest funding request of any sectors listed in the appeal. And for Moldova, the amount is around 60 million USD. And also for cash vouchers assistance are provided to both refugee population and vulnerable host population in this country. When we come to GBV risk, it is known that risk of multiple forms of gender-based violence increase in conflict and refugee settings, with women and girls being at significant risk. Ukrainian refugees face multiple risks of GBV at all stages of displacement, career flying, their home country, during flight, and while seeking refuge. High levels of intimate partner violence have been documented in the region. Risk of trafficking in persons for the purpose of sexual exploitation have also been reported by those fleeing from Ukraine. These risks were confirmed by a recent GBV safety audit conducted by UNHPA, WFP, and UNICEF. Since the beginning of the refugee influx, cash-based interventions have played a key role in the assistance and protection response to refugees from Ukraine. To date, over 71,000 refugees and around 60,000 host community members have been assisted through cash and voucher programs with the participation of many cash working group partners. Being aware of importance implementing GBV risk mitigation measures in cash and vouchers intervention, a rapid analysis was conducted in early July with the participation of 23 GBV and cash experts. Now I will be sharing the main findings and recommendations identified through this exercise. Next slide, please. During the risk analysis exercise, it is recognized by cash and GBV actors that cash interventions are key to ensure protection of refugees. However, the cash voucher assistance program should be developed and implementing considering an inclusive approach that doesn't reinforce harmful gender norms and doesn't increase GBV-related risks. Since the moment of the exercise to date, there have been some adjustments in CBI programs, cash voucher assistance programs and procedures already done. Therefore, some of the risks that I will share with you have already been addressed. And by confirming the importance of this GBV risk analysis. The main risks identified were previously an online appointment registration for cash annulment was requested, and this could represent a risk of exclusion and delays in cash distribution for some specific groups. Cash voucher assistance and GBV actors have limited awareness of existing social services such as mobile registration teams, and therefore there were vulnerable refugees that were not being considered for this modality of enrollment. This issue is being addressed after this analysis as 350 refugee families, for example, have been assisted through cash mobile enrollment teams. Older persons, especially those in support when withdrawing cash from ATMs due to the digital literacy, are vulnerable to robbery given that they usually withdraw all of their money at once in order to reduce their dependence on continued technological assistance. As such, they were at risk of economic violence and resulting to negative coping mechanisms. Another risk identified differences in the transfer values received by refugees and vulnerable host communities could lead to risk of community tensions. Separated children and older persons could be excluded from consultations regarding expenditure decision-making processes, which may increase the risk of violence and vulnerability to trafficking. There are remaining gaps on information sharing and community-based feedback and complaint mechanisms, but we are observing that the awareness is rising day by day, because according to post-distribution monitoring results for the first round, only 50% knew about complaint and feedback mechanisms, but this is increasing. And in the second round, it increased to 85% of awareness. Next slide, please. For mitigation measures and way forward, many efforts have been conducted. However, the participant of the analysis identified the need to better inform refugees on eligibility criteria, registration centers, complaint mechanisms, GBV available service, and PSEA. To date, over 2,000 frontliners have been trained on GBV core concepts and safe handling of disclosure. There's also a need to increase coordination with protection GBV actors, including national organizations and local women-led organizations to assist refugees at heightened risk in a timely and efficient manner. At the onset of response, development of tools in close coordination with the GBV sub-working group and with cash actors and local women-led organizations. Frontliners to be fully trained on PSEA, safe handling of GBV closures and referral pathways. Raising awareness is another issue which is related, giving more importance of bearing visibility items, name tags, etc. GBV actors are providing capacity building to cash voucher assistance frontliners, including hotline operators and volunteers on GBV PSEA and pocket guides. And the last thing is a second GBV risk analysis of cash programming for host population has been also requested. And this is showing growing recognition that basic cash voucher assistance risk analysis alone is not enough, and that a specific GBV and gender lens must be applied. Thank you so much.
Many thank you for the presentation. Before we move to the Q&A and the closing remarks from Lee Ashley, I would like to quickly mention, take this opportunity of today to quickly mention the work that we have been doing in Somalia last year. So this is when we were able to engage more than 120 actors, both cash and GBV experts, on GBV risk mitigation in cash. Sessions were held in Somali and in English. So we had a really good traction among local actors as well. And maybe also important to know that this whole work started because the cash working group lead, WFP, mentioned mapping of GBV risk in cash programming as an activity in the HCT Somalia Centrality of Protection Strategy. So that was a really good starting point for us. So you can put the next slide, thanks. So we had various discussions, let's say mini workshop, where we had mixed teams of GBV and cash colleagues who looked closely at Somalia cash programming. And so they filled up this risk matrix, this GBV risk matrix, and they outlined some potential GBV mitigation measures. So we have put all those results together. We looked at commonalities and we ended up with an action plan that was endorsed by the GBV subcluster and the cash working group last year. So here we have put just a few examples. And I will not go through each of them because I want to keep enough time for the Q&A. But basically, we discussed a lot about community-based targeting, of course, because lots of specific groups are being stigmatized. So making sure that women have a say in the identification of beneficiaries, especially when we use this community-based targeting approach. Another interesting point was the link of CVA with early marriage, which was not always mapped as a potential risk by cash colleagues. So that was really interesting for them. And also, and this is very similar to what George was saying about the limited access to some area in Somalia. And so private companies such as Hawalas are the de facto frontliners. And so they are the first point of contact for the beneficiaries. And of course, among the beneficiaries, you have extremely vulnerable women or people at risk. So again, like George was saying, it's really critical that we engage with them early on and we make sure that they respect do no harm, humanitarian principle, they have some basic notion of GBV, SCA, etc. So now, as you all know, we are scaling up into an L3 in Somalia. So I thought it would be useful for you to have a look at this example, this case study today. I believe there are still many recommendations outlined there that could be relevant for the response that we are preparing and delivering now in Somalia. So I will now hand over to Lee Ashley for the closing remark. She will also provide the GBV AoR perspective to this work with cash actors. Thank you so much, Lee Ashley.
Thank you so much, Luana, and thank you to all our panelists and to all of the participants. Thank you for the questions. I'll try to be brief so we have time to get to a few of those. What I wanted to speak about is really how this particular toolkit helps us ground our work in field realities. For example, it helps us to know what questions we're going to ask as part of our frontline humanitarian assessments, how we're going to consult with women and girls on cash. It helps us to know how to do better post-distribution monitoring It helps us to know how we can improve our complaint and feedback mechanisms, which is essential for our accountability to affected populations. From Afghanistan, we heard about how they're using the tools to carry risk mitigation into pooled fund allocations. And all of our case studies have really talked about the issue of data protection. So what strikes me about this toolkit is these are areas that we all work on. It doesn't matter what sector you're implementing cash for. It doesn't matter which background. We have this language of field assessments, distribution, monitoring, information management in common, and the toolkit builds on this common language. So our engagement between GBV actors and cash actors to develop these tools has really shown that we have stronger uptake and better GBV risk mitigation when we adapt our language to these field realities and the common ways that humanitarians respond. So from the GBV actor side, I can speak on behalf of the GBV AoR to say, please use this toolkit. It helps us understand what is important to cash actors and how we can work more effectively with cash actors to implement these tools and really be available. And then for cash actors, I want to stress that please do reach out to us because we take our role in providing this technical support for cash actors very seriously. We've actually made commitments to the GBV AoR call to action for 2022 to prioritize technical support to cash actors for this year and beyond. I'd also like to stress that this toolkit is our way to systematize this technical support. So it's not an option. We now have the tools so that GBV risk mitigation and cash is a must and not just a nice to have option. So let me just stress a few key points looking forward. First of all, we are planning to scale up this approach and roll out the toolkit in new contexts. So we're looking forward to new case studies next year. And more learning briefs will be coming soon. We're looking forward to Iraq and Moldova case studies, and they will be followed by others. From the GBV coordination perspective and GBV AoR, we are upscaling our training to GBV actors, including at country and regional level, so we can be better collaborators in using this toolkit at the field level. And for 2023, there is an operational study plan that's really going to look at the use of indicators to measure safety perceptions of women who are accessing cash and voucher assistance and to see how that can link to very specific mitigation measures. So getting to some of the questions in the chat, yes, Carolyn, the toolkit has very specific questions to do safety audit types of focus group discussions. So you'll find those tools there. And I think much more coming in 2023. So with that, I'd like to very much thank Isabel, Luana, and all our cash colleagues for the presentations today. And we hope that you enjoyed the webinar and that you will have learned something that will inspire you in your daily humanitarian work. So with that, I think I'll hand back to Luana, and we do have some time for a few questions.
Thank you so much, Lee Ashley, for your thoughtful words as usual. So I think we have exactly 8 minutes left for a short Q&A session. So Lee Ashley, you've been following up the Q&A window. So I let you maybe select a few and direct them to the panelists. Thank you.
Yes, I think we've had a couple of questions around the data protection issue. So I'm going to compile some of these questions and I will ask first to Afghanistan and Iraq. How did you balance ethics with regard to data sharing. So how do you balance the issue of confidentiality of participant data that's linked to women's safety, but at the same time consider fraud, corruption, and other types of issues with the use of cash? Over to you, George, and then we'll go to Maria.
All right, good. Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Leigh. The issue of data protection is something which is on our radar. For instance, at the last cash and voucher working group meeting, we were actually talking about that. So the way we are doing it is encouraging our members to ensure that they collect only minimal information which they require for implementation and not to collect unnecessary information. Then you mentioned and said maybe there are also third-party service providers who does have access to the data. Again, like I said earlier, on the political transition, we had a meeting with financial service providers where we reiterated issues to do with data protection. But again and again, we remind our members that they should put in their contracts and agreements clauses that protect beneficiary data. But I think this is still also a work in progress on our part. We want to also align with data interoperability models as subscribed to by the grant bargain, and we think we are not yet there. We want to go ahead and do that. Thank you.
Thank you, George. How about on your side, Maria?
Yeah, just maybe to add to what George said, I think that it's really important to get the consent of our beneficiaries. And for this, related to this, it's very important to have case management, case by case, to understand what are the risks that each beneficiary is exposed. For this, it's also important to have trained case managers. And yeah, as I said, like to understand case by case, what are the risks and to not expose them further just because of the matter of doing data collection, etc. But for me, what is very important is that beneficiaries themselves, they are aware also of this risk and they should provide always consent, right?
Super. Thank you so much for both of those responses. I have one more question, at least we have time for, from Patrick. In terms of Cash Plus, which activities have been used to implement and strengthen cash and voucher assistant outcomes? And let's see, do we have a volunteer for this one? Because I think it actually applies to a couple.
I'm just not so sure about what he means by the Cash Plus. So maybe I can just answer maybe. So Patrick had two questions. I can just go on the first question, and then I will give the floor also to Yi, because I think he could also complement my answer. I think, so Patrick, first question was about the relation between cash and GBV actors throughout the project cycle of cash, and who, for instance, was in charge of targeting. So I think Moldova is a really good example because we are lucky to have a UNFPA colleague in Moldova working closely with the cash working group. So in terms of project cycles, I think they are really able to work super closely. So for instance, when they are discussing about the targeting criteria, then she will just provide inputs from a GBV perspective. When they discuss about the modality of distribution, she will provide input. So from the very beginning of like the design phase of the cash programming, then they are really doing this hand in hand. And I think this is probably the best, when we have the best outcome is then when we have someone dedicated at field level working super closely with the cash working group. And when this happens, this is exactly when we have the best results. But then maybe Yiğit, if you want to complement, providing also Moldova example.
Thank you so much, Luana, for giving the floor. Since the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, its early stages, cash working group has been established. As you rightly mentioned, the UNFPA colleagues are in the process of the establishment of cash working group and also regularly participating through our meetings. So, and the person, WFP has two heads, both GBV expertise, has GBV and cash expertise, which is really beneficial for the cash working group as well. For example, I would like to link this question with another one related to post-distribution monitoring. It's a good exercise that we held here is you know, cash actors are being implemented post-distribution monitoring, but for example, we got really good feedback from UNFPA colleagues to make our PDM questions more inclusive with GBV lens as well. So it's one of the good examples that I can share from Moldova example. Over to you, thanks.
Thank you so much. Now I see, and I apologize that we don't have time to get to all the questions, but we have noted them down so that we can incorporate those questions into our development of further tools and guidance. So I do believe it's time to end this time together today. And again, I want to thank everyone for your excellent participation, learning together. So over to you, Luana, for final words.
Thank you so much, Lee Ashley. And it's indeed a bit frustrating to see those questions, but we will definitely collect them and make sure we keep them. So I would like once again to thank all the panelists today, but of course also everyone who participated in the development of the toolkit and those different pilots and case studies. So again, the toolkit is available on our GBV AoR website. And feel free to send us any comment or any question. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a good end of day or a good evening. Thank you.